name's Renae Guthridge, and I guess I've coming around the room and looking around, I can see some familiar faces, which is lovely. I've been working in the vet sector since about 2001, so I've been around for a little while, and I've had the pleasure of working in private and public RTOs, and currently I run my own small private RTO in the southwest of Western Australia. I know you're all jealous. In lovely Vass is where my RTO is. So I'm at the moment, I'm one of the presenters for the department, and I deliver a webinar called Consistency of Assessment, as well as a recognition of prior learning. So here today you're getting a snapshot of the Consistency of Assessment webinar, but as a face-to-face interaction, which is a lot more fun, because if you've ever run a webinar, it's like talking to the wall, and it can be quite disconcerting because you don't get to see lovely faces and get that interaction. So, let's get started. This is not about me, it's about you. And I think that most of you already know a little bit about validation, so I want you to just have a chat to your next door neighbour and tell them what your understanding of validation is. I'm going to give you 1 minute. Off you go. So, I'm going to pick on a few people in this room. You said you were going to come to my session, so therefore, if I know you, you might get chosen. Mark, what did you talk about just now?
Validation, two-part process. Basically, it's kind of, you look at... Oh, sorry.
Sorry, we are being videoed.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It is, yes. As long as I don't have to sing it, it'll be fine. Two-part process where you look at the assessment tools in relation to the training package that you're actually delivering, and you validate those before use. And then the second part, which used to be termed as moderation, was basically looking at those assessment tools in practice, how students have gone on by using those, whether they actually cover off on all the rules of evidence, and if need be, making changes and going through the process again.
Okay. Thank you. I can hear someone putting a hand up. Was there a hand over here? I think you've got something to... Oh, there's someone from the online. Yvette, go for it.
I need the mic first.
Yvette needs the mic. I'm not very good at hand signals, Yvette. Just shout. I don't mind. We've got a question from the ether.
Tutu.
Okay, so let me just scroll back up to the question, sorry.
What is validation?
What is validation? So Mandy felt that it was checking tools against the units and mapping rules. However, the new ASQA printout suggests differently. The fact sheet seems to mix moderation and validation somewhat. What does everyone else think?
Yes. How did I know that question or that statement about moderation and versus validation was going to come up? And in fact, I've got it sitting here in my little phone because I want to talk to you about that at some point during the morning. So yeah, I think there is some debate. There's always been debate over those two words anyway. But I think at the end of the day, what we're talking about is, in a sense, what Mark has just said, and it's about making sure that the tools that you develop are checked against the training package and all the rest of it, and then you're actually doing a follow-up process and not just letting it hang. So you're following it up with some form of what Mark termed moderation. Whether it is called that now, we can argue. Anyone else shouting out?
I think one of the key things is that it's also looking at that assessment decision. It's looking at the actual decision you made, not just the tool.
Absolutely. So I think that that's where the clarity is now coming around with the standards, that we're talking more about the decision rather than the work that we do beforehand. What was that outcome that we decided? Would we agree that that outcome does actually meet the requirements of that training package? Anyone else? Yep.
There needs to be a role as well, specifically for units of competency that have been contextualised for a specific locality. So construction is a classic in West Australia. The building techniques in the Perth region are completely different to over east.
Sure.
If you've contextualised in consultation with your industry partners for the workforce that they need, not only have you got to make sure that it matches the package requirements and the units of competency, you have to then make sure that it's valid for that context that the local industry is going to do as well.
Sure. Sure. So that's, and I totally agree. And so that conversation I heard yesterday about having an assessment bank of tools that we can all access nationally freaks me out a bit. Because how does that meet those contextualisation needs? Yeah, it doesn't. Good point. All right, you've got a job to do. Get your phones out. I know you've all got one. Type that in. You've got a question and answer. There's 3 questions, or maybe there's 4. Make sure you make it a capital K, because if you make it a little k, you end up somewhere really bad. Which I thought was a bit crazy. So there's 4 questions. All right, so this is your little survey. You probably can't, I'll just show you the live form. So the question is, have you participated in validation, yes or no? In your opinion, was the validation worthwhile, yes or no? What worked well? And the final question is, what did not work well? I don't want a book, I just want a couple of points. And that's taking you back. Again, if you want that back, I'll give you 1 more minute. So I'm going to say I have participated in validation before. Yes. What worked well? The sharing of tools. What did not work well? Sometimes people got personal. Submit. And then let's have a look. So, oh, very good. We've got some yeses, as in 34. 2 people haven't, but that's okay. That's good that you're here. Was it worthwhile? Yes, on the majority, nearly 88%, nearly 90%. What worked well? Discussion, systematic approach, validating as part of a team and discussing outcomes, having a validation checklist, looking more closely at the assessment tool to ensure that it was assessing and really needed to be assessed, reviewing the assessment with the group, contact with industry, what didn't work well. At times, time consuming, yes, interpretation, nothing worked well, excellent. Too much in too little time, the criteria set by the package, ooh. The form was a bit clunky, some people got personal. Who wrote that? All right, well done. It worked. That was the first time I've done that. I thought I'd give it a go. Like it a vet.
So did the online people.
Awesome, I love online people. Okay. That is GAFE, so Google Apps for Education. All right, so you've got a job. Oh, no, you haven't, not yet. Let's talk about the standards very briefly, but we will come back to these all through today. So this is what it says at the moment about the definition of validation. So it's saying validation is the quality review of the assessment process. It's about checking whether the assessment tools, and it talks about the words related to the rules of evidence. So it talks about validity, reliability, sufficiency, currency, and authenticity. Now, our traditional rules of evidence didn't have sufficiency in. They did have them in a few years ago, then they took them out. Anyway, they're back in. So in the actual standard itself, it focuses on those words. When you start to get into the nuts and bolts of the actual standard, it starts to bring out the terminology related to the principles of assessment. So the fairness, the flexibility, the reliability, and the validity. I knew those. To enable reasonable adjustments to be made as to whether requirements of the training package or VET course or accredited course are met, And there's this lovely little idea about this statistically valid sample, which is new to us, of the assessments and then making recommendations for future improvements. So it was this lady in the front, talked about the fact that we actually now need to look at the evidence. Now, in my 15 or so years of working in the vet sector, I've done a lot of validation, but I can honestly put my hand on my heart and say I haven't really looked at a lot of student evidence. So that's going to be a big change, particularly for me in my RTO, that we're actually going to have to start to look at those things that were deemed competent, not yet competent, etc. We did it all the time in CGA, so if you've ever worked in the Certificate of General Education for Adults, that's what they did, right back many moons ago in the 90s. So they were doing it a long, long ago before this vet sector has now started to catch on. I'm not going to ask you to comment because it'll open up an oyster of craziness. Around the room there are some questions. I'm not going to read them because when you get to that piece of paper you can write the answer yourself. This is a graffiti. On your desk you have a coloured pen. Grab it in a minute. Go to the sign. You can go to whichever one you want first. The first thing that comes to your head, write it down. Because you have knowledge about validation. I don't have it all, you have it as well. So let's share and pool our knowledge together to find out what it is we know and then where do we have to go through from here. So you go from one to the next. This is a graffiti, which means you can scribble, you can do a little love heart if you want, you can do a symbol, you can write words. What is your understanding of these things around the room? Up you jump. I'll give you 2 minutes, so it's going to be quick. So for the purposes of those online, we've got questions around aspects of assessment process needing validation, question around what is the purpose of validation, questions around what documentation you need when you validate, questions around what are our benchmarks of quality, questions around how we do it, how we validate, and questions around who wants it. Why do we have to do this? Who wants this quality assurance anyway? So you can imagine when I run a webinar event, I can't do this.
Oh yeah, you are now. I'm doing it for you, thanks.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, you have to show me how. One more minute. Whatever comes to mind, it doesn't matter if it's what someone else has written, just write it down. Try not to read what someone else has written because this is graffiti. We can do anything we want, write anything we want. "30 seconds. Very good, I like. "10 seconds. Okay, time's up. Have a seat, please. So, validation purposes. What did we come up with in the room? Would you mind jumping up and shouting out? You might need a microphone though.
I might,
Just 2 secs.
but I might not too.
Well, it's just because of the people in the cloud online, not for the ones in here. Okay, what did we say about the purposes of validation?
For the purpose of validation, we've got assurance. Want me to be loud?
Yes?
Not often that happens. Industry partnerships to get the best product, improvement, level appropriate, confidence, standard, continuous improvement, checking, confirm purpose and design, quality assurance, rules of evidence, to check reliability. Sorry if I'm missing some here. To determine if the assessment is fair, get to better. Principles of assessment, consistent quality outcomes, and industry partnerships.
Very good. And this is what I have written. So principles of assessment and rules of evidence came up a lot over here. Identify if there is an area of risk in assessment. To ensure our judgments are consistent, that came up. Determine whether different assessors using the same tools collect the same types and levels of evidence. Whilst you may not need to collect the same type of evidence, I would imagine that you would have to assess at the same level. What's that principle? Very good. Some people know. All right, what documentation is needed? Where is that? I think it's over in the end. Would you mind jumping up, sir, and telling us what the group came up with? What do we need when we validate? What documentation?
Okay, the heading was validation and documentation, and the response from the group was rigidity, consistency, make it count, clear plan and checklists with instructions and examples of how to complete, reporting the evidence, clear, concise, ×2, capture the discussion, simple, lots of it, kiss, kiss, student samples, record, unit of competency, clunky, bureaucratic, and assessment tools.
Great. I'm a real fan of the old KISS method, and it's only with the S on the end is a silly, keep it simple, silly. I think our sector is so, I guess, overloaded with paperwork, and I think there's a lot of simple ways we can do this. We tend to bring all these forms and think that this is the way that we maintain that quality, but again, it's talking about what Larry mentioned this morning. Quality doesn't mean to say doesn't equal red tape or increasing that red tape. So how can we keep that documentation as simple as possible? So these are the things that I came up with when it comes to documentation. All of those things were mentioned.
Renae, can I just, before you move on, ask your opinion? In terms of evidence, you've got there that you need to keep to bring the evidence. What's your opinion on whether you need to bring in the actual evidence, you need to bring the work samples, or do you need to just keep a comprehensive summary of the evidence that you use to make that assessment decision?
I personally think that now, with the change in the standards, you actually have to bring student evidence. And I think what that means, because you want to be able to see what the student has actually done. I think having a summary is not probably going to cut it in terms of that statistically valid sample. So that's what I think is changing, but the fact that we live in a digital age, it's not like it was 10, 20 years ago when evidence was this and it was in filing cabinets, etc. And, you know, I know when I was, assessing back in those early 2000 days, I would mark and I would keep just a sample. But I mean, that was my guess what that sample might be, whereas now it's quite prescriptive what that sample would be. But that's a personal opinion.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I guess what I'm thinking of, like a clear example for me is, would you, in your opinion, be suggesting that you would bring a completed written assessment? Let's say you've got written questions as one of your assessments. Would you be suggesting that you would need to bring the students' actual written questions, or would a marking guide where you've clearly ticked off these are the required answers, this student has actually answered, they've included this and this and this in their answer?
What do you think? Student work? Who thinks student work with the actual that they've completed? Okay, there's and who thinks the marking guide is sufficient?
You may need to, that's practical.
Yeah, look, it depends on what it is. If we're talking about an assessment that's written in hand by the student, I think there's going to be lots of ways to skin this cat, rabbit, whatever you want to say, because I love cats. But, yeah.
I'm just thinking that statistically valid sample, if you go into the suggested website,
Yes,
it's pretty much recommending that unless you've got hundreds of students, you need to then, a statistically valid sample is pretty much all of them. I mean, if you're looking at 45, if you've assessed 50 students, they're recommending that you need to be statistically valid 45 students.
all right, well,
So,
let's have a look at that in a little while. Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think we're still in those early days of trying to work out what's going to be okay and what's not going to be okay. And I think the sector in general will respond to that for sure. What were you guys chatting about over here? Okay, assessment instruments versus assessment tools. Would you like to clarify, Robin?
I just said assessment tools like individual knowledge questions or observation, where the instruments include the, your answer guide and your mapping.
Yes.
Information, like it's the whole suite put together.
Yes, that would be, yeah. Yeah, I think your instrument probably is like your tool, in a way. And then, yeah, the other bits and pieces are all the things that come around it, like your procedures, which are your instructions, your marking guide, your instructions for assessor, instructions for candidate. It doesn't matter. It's the whole thing. We can get so caught up in terminology, I believe. Okay, what else did we talk about? Who wants it? Would you mind jumping up? You're closest. Who wants quality assurance? What did the room have to say? Hang on a sec. Just grab that mic. The womble needs to be, it's quite occupational health and safety, isn't it?
Everyone.
Everyone.
All parties, everyone, me, all concerned, the RTO, students, trainers, assessors, public, industry, RTO, trainers, RTO, students, clients, students, we all do, governing body, learners and industry, RTO managers, so they don't lose the RTO. Auditors, client
helpful.
Managers, trainers, everyone, the employer who ends up with the student, trainers, RTO students.
The employer who ends up with the student. I like it. Yep. So nothing new there really. What are our benchmarks of quality? Where's this? Is that this one or is it the next? No, I can't. My eyes are a bit crazy. It's not that one. Would you mind? Yeah, what? Yep. This lady here with the blue. Would you mind jumping up and... Okay, someone else? Passing on. Yep, thank you. What are our benchmarks of quality?
Student educational outcomes.
Yep.
Read that one. Accessible, reliability, useful, standards versus outcomes met, reflect the training package, match the training package, standards, training package unit of competency, rules of evidence, training package unit of competency, assessment guidelines, cover all aspects of units and training package.
Great. Was AQF mentioned? Dove. ASQA. But not AQF. That's probably pretty important, the AQF. Because the AQF relates to what principle of assessment? Who's brave? Validity, I personally think goes back to the training package. AQF starts with an F. It's about fairness. It's about pitching it at the right level. It is not fair if you've got a Cert 3 student and you are assessing them at a Cert 1 level, or you're assessing them at a diploma level. It's about pitch at AQF. And we have to get our head around the AQF a lot more, I think, as practitioners. It's something we don't tend to pick up. It is written in convoluted language, but what it says actually does make sense. If you haven't gone to the AQF website lately, please, by all means, go there. It's got a great little spinny wheel guy. So you press on the level 4 and it spins around and it tells you what a level 4 person looks like as a summary. So you don't even have to go into the actual AQF handbook anymore. although you do if you want to find a little bit more about the volume of learning. So go and have a look at that website if you haven't recently. What aspects of the assessment process need validating? Where were we? Aspects of assessment process needing validating. So I'm going to call out. We've got the whole process, the decisions we make, the plan, student responses, assessment tools, the context which came up before. What else have we got in here? Actual process to follow. So following that actual process, where do we start? Deeming consistent outcomes from all trainers. What did I write? So the processes, the continuous improvement, the actual evidence gathering processes and tools, the judgments that we make, how we support our learners. How? Where's how? Is that how? Would someone over there, my lovely lady with the pink, would you mind jumping up and telling us about how? What did we all say? How to validate.
Okay. Identify requirements. Compare assessment tools to package with people that can help, others in industry or other RTOs. Team. Use of effective tools. Use a checklist. Collect evidence plan timetable. Inform. Useful templates. Third party. Team approach. In a group with industry experts, with trainers, step-by-step process. On the job, compare assessment documents against the training package requirements. I can't read that one. When and how often. Be organised with all your tools. Use mapping documents with industry, with a good validation tool, virtually, webinar, use of tools and templates.
Okay, thank you. I like it. I heard a lot of collaboration, a lot of team, a whole lot of different modes, virtual modes. Over the phone you can validate. There's a whole lot of different ways. I think we need to be creative now about how it is we're going to do it. It can occur before, during and after, but the new standards are being quite prescriptive about what that actually means now from their point of view. And what I've just brought to your forefront is just to remind you about some of the things you already know. I'm not standing up here to teach you how to suck eggs, so to speak, because you already have knowledge in the room about what validation is. We just now need to push that knowledge into what the new standards are now telling us that we need to be able to do. I always talk about foxes and vixens, and it's one way that I remember the principles of assessment and rules of evidence, because these underpin what sits in validation. You must know this inside out. As good trainers and assessors, you should know about the foxes and the vixens. Now, I have a very rude way of saying the foxes, but I've toned it down here because I'm working for the department. But I talk about 4 very rampant foxes, which are the principles of assessment. And then I've got a satisfied, cunning vixen. And they're my rules of evidence. So these are acronyms that I came up with years and years ago when I was talking to people about what principles of assessment are and what the rules of evidence mean. You've got to be able to have these in your head inside out. So, what was his name? 4 very rampant foxes stands for flexibility, validity, reliability and fairness. We've already talked about reliability today. We've also mentioned fairness. And validity is exactly what we're talking about for the whole thing. Flexibility we haven't really mentioned too much about, but it's something that we obviously need to take into account. And as I said right from the beginning, the standards go straight into the rules of evidence. The only thing that they bring across into here as well is, what was the other thing they brought? They had something else. Authenticity, sufficiency, currency, and validity. What was the other thing they brought in? Reliability. So they bring reliability over as right into the standards right from the beginning. But then they still do talk about the rest of the principles of assessment. You need to know those inside out. I won't test you now, I'll test you later. Let's talk a little bit more about the standards for RTOs. So standard 1, this is what it's saying, that our strategies, our training and assessment strategies and the practices have to be responsive to industry. So that's nothing new. We have to do that all the time anyway. But also to learners' needs and meet the requirements of the training packages and credit course. So nothing new. But what we have to do is develop a comprehensive plan of systematic validation. We have to ensure that plan has some sort of risk assessment approach to it, and that people who are, or trainers and assessors that are involved in this training and assessment may also participate in the validation process, but they can't be the only people involved. That's the other thing they talk about. In particular, 1.9 goes into a little bit more detail, and it talks about when it should occur, as in when we have to plan it to be occurring, what training products we're going to be validating, who's going to lead it, and who's going to be involved in it, and then what we're going to do with the outcomes and how we're going to document and act upon that. Who's already got this under control in their own RTO? Don't be brave. I have not. So for me personally, my whole validation process has changed a lot. So I've had to really think about going back to my policies and my procedures. My template, my validation template is fine because it underpins the principles of assessment and rules of evidence. I don't have to change that, but what I have to change around it is making it a little bit more formalised and to show that, I do actually have a plan for the next 5 years in terms of validation.
Hey, Renae.
Hey, Robin.
We just had an audit to scope another one just recently, and the auditor came back to me and said on our validation template checklist, which I never thought of, was something to include all the new, the way that the new training packages are rolling out with the companion guides, etc. So we had to submit our evidence back of a new validation checklist that was complementary to the new community services training package because that's what's applicable to us.
Oh,
So
that's quite interesting.
yeah, so it was I don't know, what is it? I can't even think what.
It's the companion volumes and everything.
The companion guides,
the implementation guides to do with
Yep.
the foundation skills.
Yep.
Yeah, right. Okay.
All that, and foundation skills I ended up writing in there as well that it was
Wow.
LLM practices. So just heads up.
That's interesting because my understanding of that is whatever's sitting on TGA, that's your endorsed component, and whatever sits under the ISC, which is more or less your non-endorsed component. Because if you look at differing ISCs as to what they develop for their volumes of learning and their implementation guides, some are, like the community services, massive and huge, whereas others are very scant. So yeah, that's quite interesting that they've said that is a mandatory requirement. What were you going to say?
That there are criteria that the validation team have to meet, and I imagine that would be a valuable piece of information to add to your
Policy.
validation form and your policy, because that way you can make sure that when you're audited and through the process,
Sure.
the people that are participating meet the criteria.
Yeah.
So I would imagine you'd have to tick off and say how they meet that criteria.
Yeah, you definitely have to have something like that. So maybe my template does need modifying. Damn it! Yeah, but that's a good point. So 1.10 talks about each training product, and when I first started to read this, I thought, well, what is a training product? And I'm a bit like, well, what do they mean? And a training product is a unit of competency or a competency standard. So it's not necessarily a qualification, because some RTOs don't have qualifications on their scope. What were you going to say?
Isn't that now going to start confusing the terminology?
Oh,
Training packages
Do you think? Yeah, and I guess that's still, some of this feedback needs to, it will start to filter through. But we don't want them to change the standards again. We'll work out what it means. So it's saying that it has to be validated at least once every 5 years, and 50% of your training products have to be validated within the first 3 years of each 5-year cycle. So you need, if you've got hundreds and hundreds of units of competency on your scope, I'd be starting validation pretty soon. I'd be getting it underway. And what they want to see is when you look at your training products, and I mentioned this before, that you are making an assessment as to what is more likely to be, has more risk attached to it. Why are you two over there smiling? Yeah. Excellent. I always like smilers in the room because you just never know what they're thinking. It talks about systematic validation is undertaken by one or more people who are not directly involved. So you can still validate on your own, but you can't be directly involved. So for example, for me, I could develop all my assessment tools and then I could send them off to someone who is not a trainer and assessor, or maybe a trainer and assessor, but not for me within that particular area, and I could get them to do some validation. So there's lots and lots of ways. Be creative about the way that this can get done. Obviously, we're all in the same boat, so if you've got relationships with other RTOs, this is the opportunity. Hey, Robin, to talk more about things. Robin's my mate. Yeah.
I just think that's a very ambiguous bit of the standard in terms of that reference to people not being directly involved. Now, the interpretation I received from one auditor was if I had 2 staff who were involved in assessing the same unit of competence, one could be commenting on another person's decisions, but not their own. And that was the interpretation of that.
Yeah, sure.
But I do think it's pretty ambiguous.
Yeah. I get when you say not directly involved in the particular instance, so that's where it's saying of delivery and assessment. So they could be assessing, training and assessing within that qualification, but maybe they didn't assess that particular candidate.
Well, the underlying principle being you can't make judgments about your own assessment decisions.
Sure, yeah, fair enough.
That being the
yeah,
principle.
good point.
Yeah.
And again, the same language of vocational competency and currency coming up, having current knowledge and skills within VET, and also having a training and assessment qualification. So this is not new to us. We know that these are things that have always been in place, and they're just coming down on a little bit harder. They do talk about industry experts being involved in validation, and I think that's fantastic, but we also have to remember industry experts are not necessarily trainers and assessors, don't necessarily have an understanding of VET, so we need to be, whilst what they might see as a good tool, it may not still meet the requirements of that training package. So you need to be careful when you do validate with industry experts, because they're bringing their content expertise, which is fantastic, but you've also got to have that VET hat on as well. It goes on and on and on. So I just wanted to touch on very quickly, some of you it may not be relevant to, but if you have the TAE on your scope, the Cert 4 in Training and Assessment, or plan to have any of its successors on scope, they're a little bit more vigilant around how validation occurs in this area. So it's saying that as of 2016, to deliver the AQF qual or assessor skill set from the TAE training package, the RTO must have undergone independent validation, which is interesting. So independent validation means the validation is carried out by a validator who are not employed or subcontracted by the RTO to provide training and assessment and have no other involvement or interest in the operation of the RTO.
So that would mean that you could not employ for example, I'm just sort of thinking,
yeah, I know.
For example, an auditor, a TAC auditor who is contracted through the Training and Accreditation Council.
It's to do with you as the RTO. So you could employ a TAC consultant. Yep, you could, because they don't train and assess for you as an RTO.
But they have some involvement. They do have some involvement though with us as they check on our additions to scope. So I'm just wondering as a subcontractor then to tack that?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah, I guess you might want to look for, yeah. Yeah, again, it's not black and white, is it? So if you've got a question about it, I would say use somebody else, if that's sort of raising a few uncertainties. But I have TAE on my scope, so this for me is going to be quite interesting because, you know, I don't necessarily want to validate my tools with other RTOs who have this on their scope. Or people who I wouldn't trust for their opinions. So it does open up some questions as to how we will move forward on this particular one.
They don't have to have it on their scope, they just have to have vocational competency.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. But they, yeah. And then finally, the RTO systematically evaluates and uses the outcomes of evaluations. Again, so this is talking about moving into that quality assurance part of the standard, so standard 2. Now, we can go on forever and talk more about this, and there's so much stuff out there now. I would encourage you to go to the user's guide, which has the standards, which has been written by TAC and also ASQA. So they're both pretty much written the same, except they have a couple of different references that they refer to. So ASQA have developed a fact sheet, which someone talked about early on in the morning, which is it's called conducting validation, and they have a validation sample size calculator that you can actually use. Whereas TAC refers to this particular link, RAOSoft, which is also to help you determine what is considered a statistically valid sample. So I would encourage you to go there. I am interested in finding out how you got your 45 out of your 50. I would like.
I used that. I just put in 50 units.
Yep.
And it came up with a statistically valid sample would be 45.
Of 45. It's huge, isn't it?
Massive.
I don't sort of, because then if you read the words around it, it's saying no, it's not going to be that much. But if you've actually put it in, yeah.
I mean, if you're putting in a really big number like 400,
Yes.
then
You
it is
stamp.
much smaller
Sure.
to be statistically valid.
Yes.
If you put in 20, you get 20. No, you get 20.
Yeah, and so that's where the question comes in. Do we bring 19 pieces of evidence across that whole competency standard? Yeah, so we need to be clever about
My
this.
kind of interpretation of that would be if you're actually bringing a
observation checklist that you've completed as evidence of you seeing them, you're not actually bringing a video of that person doing that particular task.
No.
You're bringing your evidence summary of that,
Yes.
which a marking guide would be the exact same thing for a written piece
Sure.
of work, a case study, whatever it may be. So in my opinion, those two things equate and have the same sort of...
Yeah, and I think you're right, because I'm not going to do that either. This is the observation checklist, this is what I did when I observed, these are the comments that I made. So yes, I think that would have to stand up. But I think when it comes down to like a written piece of paper or something, you probably want to see what some of the answers, because obviously you're then making a judgment based on those hard and fast answers that are easy to see. I don't know. I think in the observation, yes, but...
But I don't see a distinction between the observation. You're not bringing in a sample of videos to say, well, I actually want to see some of those people performing that task.
Yeah.
So for me, there isn't a distinction.
Yeah. Look, it's a good question, and I don't think we have an answer. We're certainly not going to solve it today, but I think it's something we need to certainly put to TAC or ASQA, whoever your regulator is. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say, according to ASQA's last advice on evidence, they specify that you must retain all of the evidence that's contributed to an assessment decision for 6 months up to after the last unit is completed. That is all the evidence. And that's the specific last directive from ASQA. So it's unambiguous.
Yeah, okay, yeah. In a digital age, again, I have all my students' evidence. I have it. So I could go back. It's a lot easier to do it these days, and as long as we've got access to a computer, I can show you that particular evidence. So, yeah, I don't know. Until we actually start getting into it and actually finding out what the issues are, we're not really going to be able to sort of answer some of these questions yet, are we? It'll be very interesting. What else does it say? We've already talked lots about how this is going to impact on us. And some of you have come out with what things you're going to start to need to change in your own RTO. Just have a chat to your mate, your next door neighbour, for about a minute and just reflect on what we've been talking about and tell your mate what it is you're going to need to change in your RTO, given what we've been discussing. TAC haven't put out a fact sheet yet on validation. Only ASQA have. So I was quite keen to read the fact sheet. I'm a TAC RTO. Sorry, so I was quite keen to read the fact sheet that ASQA had put out, which has only been put out within the last week or so. And I was quietly freaking out. I don't know how anyone else was feeling, because it really flew in the face of my understanding of what I thought validation was. I'm thinking, oh, okay. And one thing that they do talk about within the fact sheet, which I'd encourage you to go and have a look at, so just put in fact sheet conducting validation and you'll find it. It says, how is validation different from moderation? It talks about moderation is a quality control process aimed at bringing assessment judgments into alignment. They talk about moderation generally being conducted before the student's result is given, whereas validation is about looking at the outcome that we have, or the result that we have already given that particular candidate, which makes a little bit of sense to me. I go, okay, fine. So what they do at a university level, I know this happens a lot in higher ed, is that they will conduct moderation exercises. They'll mark all the students' work, but before they give the students the results, they will come and they will look at what they've done, and then they give those results. So they don't talk about moderation in the way that we see moderation in the past. So that's changed for me, and I'm thinking it's changed for some of you, giving the looks that I'm getting. It says, what does it also say? The requirement in the standards to undertake validation of assessment judgments does not affect your RTO's ability to undertake moderation activities or any other processes aimed at increasing the quality of assessment. So you can still moderate, but according to the standards, what they're focusing on is this idea of validation. So I'd encourage you to go and read that fact sheet, because it's quite interesting. It's a bit scary as well. So I'm just going to give you something to think about as you walk out of the room. Now, this is a model that I think is probably worthwhile considering if you're wanting to try and make sure you're hitting all those nails on the heads. So it's a sample assessment process, and I think it's something that all assessors can always get better at doing. All trainers and assessors can get better at developing assessment tools that meet whatever it is that we're meaning to align our assessments to. So I've got two sides here. We're starting off with the unit of competency. So the first thing we want you to do is unpack that unit of competency. This is the old version, obviously, with critical aspects, range statement, etc. This is the new version. So the first thing you need to do is have a good look at those units of competency. I challenge that probably doesn't always happen. I think we're probably all gluttons for punishment and going maybe just to the performance criteria or the elements and forgetting about the rest of the bits and pieces. But this is the idea of that we do a thorough analysis. Then we can actually develop what's called a requirements list. So this is just bringing down the units, and again, old version versus new version, into what it is that we're actually looking for. So it's, I guess, cutting and pasting the actual standard into some sort of table. So again, you're really narrowing in on that focus. And then going, all right, now that I've worked out what the mandatory requirements are of that particular unit, checking that with someone else, having a chat, do you think that this is what I'm meant to be meeting by looking at this particular unit? So validating your particular list. And then that can actually start to, I don't like the fact that my guy's right in the middle there, help you prepare your actual evidence gathering plan. So that unit requirements list, so this guy here, can actually now be extended to show the relationship between the unit requirements and evidence sources. So you're pulling it out and you're saying to yourself, all right, these are my sources of evidence. I'm going to have a workplace project 1, workplace project 2, a simulation 1, a simulation 2, and a question and answer. So then you're going to shade those cells that don't apply, and the blank cells in the column provide a space to record the evidence. So what we're trying to do is just keep everything into, I guess, one nice process that's flowed through, that you don't have to start to think about creating things in a random order that you're not necessarily going to meet that unit of competency. So I'll just take you through a little bit more. It's talking about when you're thinking about your required knowledge or your knowledge evidence as opposed to your performance evidence, it's about assessing the know-how, the tell me. So you're thinking about assessing them using written and oral questioning, written and oral tests. So that knowledge evidence or that required knowledge that's how it should be assessed, through a question and answer. And often that question and answer can be very short. I usually write my required knowledge at the end, and usually it's because I've come across a couple of gaps that haven't been met in the actual other parts of the assessments I've developed. Whereas I've seen some required knowledge tests that are like 150 questions long. It's crazy. Further into this, we're talking about the validity, reliability and sufficiency. So we're thinking about, again, assessing this required knowledge and required evidence. So again, asking yourself these questions. Is the AQF level appropriate? Is the contents and content relevant to the unit? Is all the required knowledge being covered? So this is a plan. Now, I'm not going to go through the rest of it because obviously the time is coming to a close. But I would encourage you to come and have a look at these slides, because then it goes into thinking about the required skills, performance evidence, and how you can start to bring out that matrix more and more in order to then actually meet that whole unit of competency. So it's just a different way of thinking about developing your assessments so you can hit all of those bits and pieces on the head. All right, so I'm not going to go through that right now because I want to ask you a couple more questions before you get to go. All right, so before you go, answer the following with a yes, no or maybe. I've learned something about validation during the session. I would change some of the assessment processes I currently use. I think we all have to say yes for that one. I'm a bit more confident about validating with others and sharing my assessment processes. And I'm sure that there's other things we need to know, but because we've come to a close, did you want to say one thing?
Yeah, yep. I think it's a really important question. ASQA has just recently released how much you validate, and they've set a minimum of 2 units per qualification. And all of a sudden, it wasn't every unit in every qualification that RTOs had to validate. So now, and TAC is saying, no, we're just going to, leave it as all the training products, which is all of the units in the qual. So
I actually can't find where ASQA has said that.
Yeah, they said it last week.
In a forum.
Yeah, they said a minimum of 2 units per qual.
Well,
which
because
makes a huge
I had
work
read
difference.
some of that as well, but until it's written in black and white in my hot little hands and it's on a proper document, that's when I would start to ask.
I heard yesterday from a TAC auditor who was here at the forum.
Yep.
ASQA and TAC are still arguing this.
Excellent. We'll let them argue and then they can tell us what they want to do.
At the forum, ASQA auditors said that is what they will be auditing, but that's not what's required.
Aha.
They will do their sample on 2 units.
Aha.
But it still requires all the units.
Thank you.
That was verified by them.
Okay, good.
And that was with both parties present, TAC and ASQA.
Yes, you will have the PowerPoint will be available. Thank you, everyone. I hope you got something out of it.
Authorised by the Government of Western Australia, Perth.